Welcome back to Nightfall Notions, where we explore the strange, the mundane, and the downright miserable corners of history. If you enjoy these boring bedtime stories, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a tale of woe, tedium, or historical inconvenience. Tonight, we delve into the first chapter of our series on why it sucked to be married to a lord in the Dark Ages. Chapter 1. The Joy of Arranged Marriages. Imagine, if you will, a world where love was not so much a feeling as it was a transaction. A world where the phrase "till death do us part" was less a romantic vow and more a contractual obligation, often negotiated between two men who had never met the bride in question. Such was the reality of noble marriages in the Dark Ages, where the concept of choice was as foreign as a pineapple in medieval Europe. Our story begins not with a meet-cute or a stolen glance across a crowded hall, but with a ledger. A very important ledger filled with numbers, land deeds, and the occasional doodle of a disgruntled scribe. This ledger belonged to Lord Aldrich of Blackmore, a man whose estate was vast, whose temper was short, and whose daughter, Lady Eleanor, was of marriageable age. Marriageable, of course, being a polite term for useful. Eleanor had known this day would come. From the moment she could walk, she had been groomed for this singular purpose, to be traded like a prized heifer to the highest bidder. Her education consisted of needlework, basic Latin, enough to recite prayers, but not enough to question them, and the fine art of suppressing her own opinion. By the time she turned 16, she was as prepared as one could be for a life of smiling politely while her husband ignored her. The negotiations began over a feast that Eleanor was not invited to attend. Lord Aldrich sat across from Lord Godfrey of Hargrove, a man whose breath smelled of onions and whose laughter sounded like a dying goose. They clinked goblets of watered-down wine and spoke of alliances, of border disputes, of the strategic value of a certain patch of land that just so happened to lie between their estates. Eleanor's name was mentioned only once, and even then, it was followed by a discussion of her dowry. When the deal was struck, Eleanor was informed of her impending nuptials by her father's steward, a man who delivered the news with all the enthusiasm of a man announcing the arrival of a particularly dull tax collector. She was to marry Lord Godfrey in a fortnight. There would be no courtship, no opportunity to voice her thoughts on the matter. Her sole comfort was the knowledge that her new husband was only twice her age, which by medieval standards was practically a love match. The wedding itself was a spectacle of obligation. The church was cold, the priest mumbled through the vows, and the feast afterward was attended by men who cared more for the roasted boar than the bride. Eleanor sat beside her new husband, who spent the evening discussing hunting dogs with his brother. She smiled when required, nodded when appropriate, and wondered if this was what her life would be, a series of performances for an audience that wasn't watching. That night, in a chamber that smelled of damp rushes and candle smoke, Eleanor met her husband properly for the first time. He was a man of few words, most of which were about himself. He did not ask her opinions, nor did he seem particularly interested in her as a person. His attentions were brisk, impersonal, and over quickly. Eleanor lay awake long after he had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was all there would ever be. Meanwhile, in another part of the castle, Lord Aldrich toasted his own cleverness. The alliance was secure, the land was his, and his daughter was someone else's problem. Love, after all, was for peasants. Nobility had contracts. And so began Eleanor's life as a lord's wife, a life of quiet servitude, of smiling through gritted teeth, of being seen but never heard. The romantic beginnings of her marriage were, like so many others, nothing more than political alliances and property exchanges disguised as love stories. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. Your Dowry, a one-way gift. The morning after her wedding, Eleanor woke to the sound of servants shuffling in and out of the chamber, carrying away the remnants of last night's feast, and, presumably, any evidence that a marriage had taken place at all. The bed beside her was empty. Lord Godfrey had risen at dawn to inspect his new lands, the ones that had come with her. Because that was the true purpose of a dowry, not to enrich the bride, but to fatten the groom's coffers with no possibility of a refund. Eleanor's dowry had been substantial. A chest of silver coin, 3 parcels of fertile land, and a small but profitable mill on the river that had been in her family for generations. But all of it now belonged to Godfrey, as irrevocably as if she had never existed. The law, as it so often did in matters concerning women, had made sure of that. She dressed slowly, assisted by a maidservant who avoided her eyes. The girl was new, likely part of the household staff that had come with Eleanor, another line item in the dowry agreement, like cattle or sacks of grain. Eleanor wondered if the girl resented her for it. She certainly would have in her place. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Godfrey was already deep in conversation with his steward, a wiry man named Osbert, who had the look of someone who enjoyed counting other people's money. They pored over a ledger, murmuring about rents and yields and the improved productivity of the mill, now that it was under proper management. Proper, of course, meaning Godfrey's. Eleanor picked at a piece of bread, listening. No one asked her opinion on the mill, though she had grown up visiting it, had known the miller's family since childhood, had even suggested improvements to the grinding mechanism once. But that knowledge, like the mill itself, no longer belonged to her. Later that day, she was summoned to her father-in-law's study. Lord Hargrove the elder was a man who had outlived 2 wives and most of his teeth, and he regarded Eleanor with the same mild interest one might show a new piece of furniture. "The dowry's been accounted for," he said, by way of greeting. "Your father kept his word." "That's something, at least." Eleanor nodded, unsure if a response was expected. "The mill's in good condition," he continued, "though the workers are lazy. We'll have to tighten things up." She thought of the miller's son, who had once shown her how to skip stones on the river. Would he be whipped for resting too long between sacks of grain now? She kept her mouth shut. "The land near the eastern border is disputed," Hargrove mused, more to himself than to her. "Your father swore it was free of lines, but I'll have my men verify. Can't be too careful with these things." Eleanor wondered if her father had lied. She wouldn't put it past him. The conversation, if it could be called that, ended as abruptly as it had begun. Hargrove dismissed her with a wave, already turning his attention back to a map spread across the table. She was halfway out the door when he added, without looking up, "You'll dine with us tonight." "Godfrey expects it," as if she had anywhere else to go. The days that followed settled into a pattern of quiet erasure. Eleanor's belongings, what few she had brought with her, were absorbed into the household as though they had always been there. Her clothes were unpacked into chests she did not own. The silver mirror that had been her mother's was placed on a dressing table in a room that was not hers. Even her name seemed to dissolve. She was no longer Eleanor of Blackmore, but Lady Hargrove, a title that felt like a borrowed cloak. The worst of it came a fortnight later, when Godfrey informed her that her personal maidservant, a girl named Agnes who had been with her since childhood, was to be reassigned to his sister's household. "She's a skilled seamstress," he said, as if that explained it. "Marian needs one." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. Agnes was heirs, part of the dowry, surely. But no, that was the trap. Everything given was given away. She had no more claim to Agnes than she did to the mill or the silver coins, or the land that had once been her birthright. Agnes left without complaint, though her eyes were red-rimmed when she bid Eleanor farewell. "You'll visit," Eleanor said, knowing it was a lie even as she said it. Agnes nodded, equally aware. And just like that, another thread of Eleanor's old life was snipped away. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Godfrey's snores, she thought of the mill by the river. The workers would be asleep in their cottages, unaware that the hands of the clock had shifted, that the rhythm of their lives would soon be dictated by a lord, who had never set foot inside its walls until the deed was signed. Her father, no doubt, was congratulating himself on a bargain well struck. Her dowry had bought her a husband, secured an alliance, and left her with nothing but the faint hope that she might one day bear a son, because sons, at least, were considered permanent acquisitions. Daughters, on the other hand, were always temporary. Their value lay in what could be carried away in a chest. Chapter 3. The Lord's Wandering Eye and Hands. Eleanor had been married for 3 months when she first noticed the way the kitchen maid, a plump girl with auburn hair, flinched whenever Lord Godfrey walked past her. It was a subtle thing, a quick duck of the chin, a slight tightening of the shoulders, the kind of movement one only learned to make after unpleasant experience. Eleanor might not have noticed at all had she not developed, in her short time as Lady Hargrove, a keen eye for the small miseries of others. She saw it again the next week, this time when Godfrey lingered near the cellar stairs where the girl was fetching wine. His hand brushed against her waist as he passed, lingering just a moment too long to be accidental. The maid froze, her face carefully blank, as though if she pretended hard enough not to notice it might not be happening. Godfrey smirked and continued on his way, whistling. Eleanor said nothing. What was there to say? A lord's appetites were his own business, and any wife who made a fuss risked being labeled shrewish, jealous, or worse, unbearably tedious. The church might preach fidelity, but the nobility had long ago decided that such rules were for peasants, who couldn't afford the scandal. The real insult came not from Godfrey's wandering hands, but from the way everyone around her pretended not to see them. The steward looked the other way. The other servants developed sudden intense interests in floors or ceilings whenever their lord cornered a serving girl. Even Lady Hargrove the elder, Godfrey's mother, had only sighed when Eleanor tentatively broached the subject over needlework one afternoon. "Men have their needs," the older woman had said, not looking up from her embroidery. "As long as he isn't flaunting it in court or getting bastards on noble daughters, it's best to let them be." Eleanor stabbed her needle into the linen, a little harder than necessary. The situation came to a head during the harvest feast, when Godfrey, deep in his cups, decided that the baker's daughter, a girl of no more than 16, was the evening's entertainment. He pulled her onto his lap with a laugh that was half a belch, his hands roaming freely as the girl turned the color of old parchment. The room carried on as though nothing were amiss. Minstrels played, nobles laughed, and the girl's own father busied himself with a jug of ale rather than make a scene. Eleanor sat very still, her fingers clenched around her goblet. She knew what would happen if she spoke. Knew the sighs, the eye rolls, the patient explanations about how these things were simply the way of the world. Knew that the only person who would bear any consequence for the disruption would be her. So she did nothing. Later, when the feast had dissolved into drunken sprawls and the baker's daughter had slipped away, whether to escape or because Godfrey had tired of her, Eleanor couldn't say, she found herself cornered by Lady Marian, Godfrey's sister. "You'll get used to it," Marian said, sipping her wine. She was a sharp-faced woman who wore her bitterness like a fine perfume. "They all do it. My husband keeps a mistress in the village. Gives her jewelry, the bastard. At least yours is too cheap for that." Eleanor wondered if this was meant to be comforting. The worst part wasn't even the infidelity itself. It was the sheer mundanity of it. Godfrey's indiscretions weren't the grand passions of troubadour songs, but grubby little encounters with servants and tradesmen's daughters, as impersonal as a man scratching an itch. He didn't love these women, didn't even particularly like them. They were simply there, and he could take them, and so he did. Eleanor learned to recognize the signs. The way he'd return from hunting trips with his tunic suspiciously rumpled, though no game ever seemed to be bagged. The occasional smirk from a stable boy who knew too much. The way certain maids suddenly found reasons to work in distant parts of the castle when Godfrey was in one of his moods. Once she made the mistake of confronting him. It was after a particularly blatant incident. A laundress had fled the linen closet in tears, her kirtle half unlaced, and Eleanor, against her better judgment, had dared to voice disapproval. Godfrey had stared at her as though she'd grown a second head. "What do you care?" he'd asked, genuinely baffled. "It's not as though I'm neglecting my duties to you." The duties, of course, being the grim, perfunctory couplings that occurred whenever Godfrey decided it was time to try for an heir. Those, at least, were blessedly brief. By the time winter settled over Hargrove Keep, Eleanor had perfected the art of strategic blindness. She no longer flinched when a serving girl avoided her eyes, no longer tensed when Godfrey disappeared into the stables with the new farrier's wife. She told herself it didn't matter, that none of it mattered. And then came the day she walked into the Solar to find her own maidservant, the quiet girl who helped her dress each morning, hastily straightening her skirts while Godfrey adjusted his belt. The girl, Alice, her name was Alice, looked at Eleanor with something worse than guilt. It was resignation. The look of someone who knew no apology would come, because none was expected. Godfrey merely yawned. "Tell cook we'll want mutton for supper," he said, as though nothing had happened, and strolled out. Eleanor stood very still, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade down the corridor. Alice said nothing. What was there to say? Later, in the privacy of her chamber, Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall and breathed. She didn't cry. Crying would have meant she still expected something better. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the castle in a pristine white shroud. Somewhere in the village the baker's daughter would be kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. The laundress would be scrubbing linens in icy water. The farrier's wife would be pretending not to notice the knowing looks from her neighbors. And Eleanor, Lady Hargrove, would wake tomorrow and do it all again. Because that was what noblewomen did. They endured. And if sometimes, in the dark, Eleanor imagined wrapping her hands around Godfrey's throat and squeezing until that smug, complacent face turned purple, well, that was her own business. Chapter 4. Cooking, cleaning, and other peasant work. Eleanor had always assumed that being Lady of Hargrove Keep would mean a life of leisure, or at the very least, a life where other people did the actual work. She had imagined herself sitting gracefully by the fire, perhaps dictating letters or occasionally nodding approval at household accounts while servants flitted about like well-trained moths. The reality was significantly more irritating. It turned out that managing a castle full of servants was less about giving elegant commands and more about preventing the entire place from collapsing into chaos, starvation, or accidental self-immolation. The servants, bless them, were perfectly capable of performing their individual tasks, provided someone told them exactly what to do, when to do it, and in what order, and then checked 5 more times to ensure they hadn't misinterpreted simple instructions like "don't store the salt next to the lye." Theoretically, the steward was supposed to handle such things. In practice, Osbert had the organizational skills of a concussed squirrel. Left to his own devices, he would forget to order grain until the last sack was down to crumbs, then panic and buy moldy barley at triple the price from a passing merchant who seemed trustworthy. He once scheduled the annual candle-making during the same week as the sheep shearing, resulting in a catastrophic overlap of boiling wax and irritable livestock that took months to fully clean up. Which was how Eleanor found herself, on a damp Tuesday morning, elbow-deep in household accounts while Osbert stood nearby, sweating nervously and repeatedly mispronouncing tallow. "The tally from last month's Halloween purchases seems to be missing," he said, rifling through a stack of parchment scraps, like a man who had never encountered the concept of filing. Eleanor resisted the urge to press her forehead directly onto the table. "You mean the records for the candles we just made?" "Ah, yes. Those." She had been at Hargrove for nearly a year now, and in that time she had learned that the true burden of nobility was not in the grand decisions. Declaring war, signing treaties, choosing which peasant to execute for poaching, but in the endless, mind-numbing minutiae of keeping several dozen people from starving, freezing, or poisoning themselves. Take supper, for example. Planning a single meal required a level of strategy that would have put a battlefield commander to shame. There were rations to calculate based on who was eating. Were there guests? Had Godfrey invited his hunting companions again without telling her? Supplies to account for? Did they have enough salted meat, or had the cellar rats staged another daring raid? And the ever-present threat of culinary disaster. Cook, while well-intentioned, had a tendency to experiment with spices in ways that left diners coughing up flavors never meant for you. And then there was the cleaning. Castles, as it turned out, were appallingly good at accumulating filth. Rushes on the floor became sticky with spilled ale and food scraps within hours. Tapestries collected dust like they were being paid for it. Even the walls seemed to exude a fine layer of grime, as though the stones themselves were sweating disapproval. Servants could scrub and sweep and haul water until their hands cracked, but without someone standing over them, reminding them to actually move the furniture while they swept. The filth simply migrated from one surface to another in a grotesque game of hide and seek. Eleanor had once walked into the great hall to find a maidservant diligently sweeping around a bench, leaving a perfect rectangle of dirt beneath. When questioned, the girl had blinked at her in genuine confusion. "But the bench is on the floor, my lady." It was enough to make a woman consider arson. The worst part was that none of this labor was considered real work. Godfrey certainly didn't think so. He would swan in after a day of hunting, which, as far as Eleanor could tell, mostly involved drinking in the woods and possibly napping against a tree, take one look at the freshly scrubbed floors and the organized pantry, and say something like, "Good, you've had a nice, restful day." Meanwhile, Eleanor had personally intervened in a near-disastrous attempt by the kitchen boy to help by washing the salt in water, because it looked dirty, mediated a screaming match between the laundress and the dairymaid over who had stolen whose bucket, and discovered that the reason everyone's linens smelled like rancid fat was because someone had decided to use bacon grease as a fabric softener. And yet, if she dared complain, she would be met with bafflement. Ladies didn't work after all. They supervised. Never mind that supervising often meant doing the task yourself at double the speed just to get it over with. Take the time the well water turned foul. For 3 days, the entire castle had been drinking from a contaminated supply because the stablemaster insisted the odd taste was just minerals and the steward refused to spend money on having it inspected. It wasn't until Eleanor, after watching 2 scullery maids vomit in unison, marched out to the well herself, hauled up a bucket, and practically shoved it under Osbert's nose that anyone took action. Even then, the solution had somehow become her responsibility. She was the one who had to arrange for the well to be cleaned, the one who had to organize temporary water from the village, the one who had to listen to Godfrey complain about the inconvenience of it all. "I don't see why this is your concern," he'd said, wrinkling his nose at the taste of the boiled and strained emergency water. "Isn't this what servants are for?" Eleanor had fantasized very briefly about holding his head under water until he understood the gravity of the situation. By the end of her 2nd year at Hargrove, she had developed what she privately called her management face, a carefully blank expression that concealed the simmering rage of a woman who had just found the 30th unlabeled barrel in the cellar and was this close to taking an axe to all of them on principle. Once she had also developed a series of extremely creative curses, which she muttered under her breath while counting linens or inspecting cheese for mold. The cheeses, like the servants, seemed determined to test her patience. Just last week, she had caught the dairymaid attempting to rehabilitate a spoiled wheel by scraping off the green bits and calling it herbed. Sometimes, in her darker moments, Eleanor wondered if this was the real reason noblemen married. Not for alliances or dowries, but because someone needed to prevent their households from collapsing into a Lord of the Flies-esque nightmare of mismanaged provisions and hygiene-related plague. And the truly galling part? If she did her job perfectly, if the meals were served on time, the floors were clean, and no one died of dysentery, no one noticed. But let one supper be late, or one guest find a mouse dropping in their bedchamber, and suddenly she was incompetent. It was enough to make a woman want to abandon civilization altogether. Perhaps that was why one evening, after discovering that the new batch of soap had been made with rancid fat again, Eleanor found herself staring into the fire and contemplating the merits of running away to become a hermit. Surely living in a cave would be simpler. At least caves didn't expect you to manage their inventories. Chapter 5. The delicate art of birth control, or lack thereof. Eleanor had known from the start that her primary function as Lady Hargrove was reproductive. The dowry had been the initial transaction, but the real payment would be an heir, preferably male, preferably robust, and preferably delivered before Godfrey grew impatient enough to start questioning her fertility in public. What no one had mentioned was how thoroughly unpleasant the entire process would be. Take the act itself, for instance. Godfrey approached the matter with all the enthusiasm of a man paying a tax bill, swift, perfunctory, and with a distinct air of resentment. There was no conversation beforehand, no tenderness afterward. He would arrive in her chambers unannounced, often smelling of wine or horse, or some combination of the two, and the only warning Eleanor would receive was the creak of the bed frame as he climbed atop her. She had learned early on that making noise, any noise, only prolonged the ordeal. Godfrey seemed to interpret gasps or whimpers as encouragement, so Eleanor perfected the art of lying perfectly still, her mind detached, floating somewhere near the ceiling where none of this could touch her. Sometimes she counted the stones in the wall. Other times she recited prayers backwards. Once, memorably, she composed an entire mental ballad about the life cycle of turnips. Afterward, he would roll off her with a grunt, adjust his clothing, and leave without a word. Eleanor would lie there, staring at the canopy, listening to her own heartbeat slow, wondering if this time it had taken. The midwife, a gnarled old woman named Agnes with breath like rotten onions, had given Eleanor the usual advice for conceiving. Pray to St. Margaret, eat plenty of red meat, and avoid bathing during certain phases of the moon. She had also suggested hanging a weasel's testicles around her neck, a recommendation Eleanor had politely declined. Some women swear by it, Agnes had said, shrugging. Of course, some women also swear by sitting on hot stones, but I wouldn't recommend that unless you fancy a scorched arse. When Eleanor had tentatively asked about ways to prevent pregnancy, purely out of curiosity, of course, Agnes had stared at her as though she'd suggested dancing naked in the churchyard. Now why would a fine lady like yourself be asking about oye thought? The midwife had said, her voice dropping to a whisper. That's witch's business, that is. Eleanor had dropped the subject. The first time her courses failed to arrive, she had felt a peculiar mix of relief and dread. Relief because at least now Godfrey would leave her alone for a while. Dread because she had heard enough whispers in the birthing chambers to know what came next. Pregnancy, as it turned out, was its own special hell. The nausea began at dawn and lingered like an unwelcome guest, turning even the smell of fresh bread into an ordeal. Her breasts ached constantly, her back throbbed, and her moods swung between tears and rage with no warning. Once she had burst into furious sobs because a servant brought her the wrong color ribbon. Another time, she had nearly thrown a goblet at Godfrey's head when he remarked that she was getting fat. The other noblewomen offered advice that ranged from useless to actively dangerous. Lady Marian suggested drinking powdered pearls in wine for the complexion, while Godfrey's aunt insisted that eating rabbit would make the baby timid. The castle chaplain, meanwhile, took every opportunity to remind Eleanor that childbirth was Eve's punishment for original sin, which did wonders for her morale. The birth itself was worse than she had imagined. 13 hours of pain so intense she briefly forgot her own name, assisted by Agnes and a rotating cast of women who alternated between telling her to push and telling her to be quiet. Godfrey naturally was nowhere to be seen. Men considered the birthing chamber beneath them, though they were happy to barge in the moment it was over to inspect the results. When the baby finally emerged, a squalling, red-faced boy, Eleanor was too exhausted to feel anything beyond a dull sense of accomplishment. They placed him in her arms, still sticky with blood, and she stared at him, waiting for the rush of love the other mothers had described. All she felt was tired. Godfrey, of course, was ecstatic. He strutted around the castle like a rooster, boasting to anyone who would listen about his virility, as though he'd personally done the hard part. The child was christened Aldrich after Eleanor's father, a political gesture, not a sentimental one, and promptly handed off to a wet nurse so Eleanor could recover and get back to her real job, producing spares, because one son was never enough. What if Aldrich caught the pox? What if he fell down a well? What if he grew up to be a poet? No, a lord needed backups, preferably several. So the cycle began again. Eleanor had hoped that bearing an heir might earn her some respite, but if anything, Godfrey became more relentless. Now that they knew she was fertile, there was no excuse for delay. Never mind that her body felt like it had been run through a meat grinder. Never mind that the mere thought of another pregnancy made her want to scream. Her duty was clear. She tried, half-heartedly, to employ the whispered-about methods of prevention. There were herbs, supposedly, slippery elm, pennyroyal, tansy, but acquiring them without raising suspicion was nearly impossible. The apothecary in the village gave her strange looks when she asked, and the castle gardener refused to grow anything that might be unnatural. Once in desperation she attempted the old trick of jumping up and down vigorously after coupling, only to be caught by a passing servant who gave her such a look of pity that Eleanor never tried it again. By the time she missed her courses for the second time, she was almost too numb to care. Almost. The second pregnancy was harder than the first. Her body, not yet fully recovered, rebelled with a vengeance. The nausea lasted all day, the back pain never eased, and her ankles swelled to the size of small melons. Even Godfrey noticed, though his solution was to suggest she walk it off. The birth was worse, too. Longer, bloodier, and this time ending not with a squalling infant, but with a tiny, still form wrapped hastily in linen. A girl. They didn't even let Eleanor hold her. "Better luck next time," Agnes said, patting her hand with startling indifference. Eleanor lay in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was supposed to mourn. Would it be improper to cry? Would it be improper to? No one had given her instructions for this part. Godfrey, when he visited, looked vaguely annoyed, as though she'd inconvenienced him by failing to produce a living child. "Well, get some rest," he said, already turning to leave. "We'll try again soon." The worst part was that he meant it. By the third pregnancy, Eleanor had developed a sort of grim resignation. Her body was no longer entirely her own. It was a vessel, a thing to be used until it broke. She moved through the days like a sleepwalker, eating what she was told, drinking what she was told, lying still when she was told. When the child, another boy, this one sickly, survived, she felt nothing but relief that at least she wouldn't have to go through it again immediately. But of course she did. And again. And again. 5 pregnancies in 6 years. 3 live children. 2 tiny graves. Her body ached constantly now, her back permanently sore, her stomach streaked with silvery lines as though even her skin had given up trying to hold itself together. The other noblewomen nodded approvingly. "You've been blessed," they said, as though spending half her life either pregnant or recovering from birth was a privilege. Eleanor smiled and agreed, because what else could she do? One evening, as she sat by the fire, her youngest, a girl named Matilda, after Godfrey's mother, asleep in her arms, she found herself staring into the flames and wondering if this was all her life would ever be. A never-ending cycle of pain and blood and tiny, demanding creatures who would grow up to resent her just as much as she resented her own parents. Matilda stirred in her sleep, her tiny fist clutching Eleanor's sleeve. For a moment, just a moment, Eleanor felt something. a flicker of warmth, of connection. Then the baby woke and began to wail, and the moment passed. Godfrey, passing by the door, frowned. "Can't you keep it quiet?" Eleanor rocked the child mechanically, humming a tuneless lullaby. Somewhere, in another castle, another noblewoman was lying beneath her husband, counting stones in the wall. Somewhere, a midwife was wrapping another stillborn in linen. Somewhere, a lord was complaining that his wife wasn't producing heirs fast enough. Eleanor closed her eyes and kept humming. Chapter 6. Your opinion, best kept to yourself. Eleanor had learned many lessons in her years at Hargrove Keep, but none so thoroughly as this. A woman's wisdom was only welcome when it was solicited, and even then, it had to be delivered with the delicacy of a trained falconer handling a skittish bird. Too firm a grip and you draw blood, too loose, and the entire thing would fly straight into disaster. The first time she made the mistake of offering unsolicited advice, it had been about something utterly uncontroversial, the storage of grain. A wet summer had left the harvest damp, and Eleanor had noticed the telltale signs of mold creeping into the sacks near the cellar walls. She mentioned it to Godfrey in passing, suggesting they move the grain to a drier part of the storeroom before it spoiled entirely. Godfrey had stared at her for a long moment, his expression hovering between confusion and irritation. "The steward handles such matters," he said finally, in the tone one might use to explain basic arithmetic to a dim child. 2 weeks later, half the grain had to be thrown out. No one acknowledged that Eleanor had been right. The second time, she had been more cautious. It was during a discussion about the upcoming visit from Lord Devereux, a neighboring noble whose fondness for hunting had once resulted in the accidental slaughter of a farmer's prize pig, an incident that had nearly sparked a feud. Eleanor waited until Godfrey had finished complaining about Devereux's tendency to exaggerate his kills, then murmured, "They might arrange the hunt near the western woods this time. Fewer farms that way." Godfrey had blinked, then shrugged. "I suppose." The hunt went smoothly, the pig population remained unharmed, and Godfrey later boasted to his companions about his clever planning. Eleanor, who had made the suggestion while mending his shirts, said nothing. This was how it worked. A good wife's counsel was like a well-placed stitch, invisible but essential, and never, ever credited. The real trouble began when she slipped. It happened during a feast celebrating Aldrich's 7th birthday. The great hall was crowded with nobles, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine. Lord Devereux was holding court near the fireplace, regaling a group of increasingly uncomfortable guests with a story about a boar hunt that grew more improbable with each telling. The beast was enormous, I tell you, near the size of a small horse. Its tusks alone could gore a man clean through. Eleanor, passing by with a tray of sweetmeats, because of course no one had thought to have a servant do it, couldn't resist. "Funny," she said lightly. "I could have sworn you said last year it was the size of a donkey." The room went very quiet. Devereux's face flushed an impressive shade of puce. Godfrey, standing nearby, looked as though he'd been slapped. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, Godfrey had been furious. "What in God's name were you thinking?" Eleanor had known better than to defend herself. "It was a jest," she said, keeping her eyes downcast. "A jest." Godfrey's voice was dangerously soft. "Do you have any idea how that makes me look? Letting my wife mock my guests." Eleanor bit the inside of her cheek. Letting? As though she were a disobedient hound that had slipped its leash. "You will apologize to Devereux tomorrow," Godfrey said, turning away as though the matter were settled. Eleanor said nothing. But that night, as she lay stiffly beside him, she imagined all the cutting replies she could have made. That Devereux was a pompous fool. That his stories grew taller with each telling. That if Godfrey was so concerned about mockery, perhaps he shouldn't associate with men claimed to have slain mythical beasts. She kept those thoughts to herself. The apology the next morning was excruciating. Devereux accepted it with a smugness that made Eleanor's teeth ache, then proceeded to tell the story of the boar Agin, this time with added embellishments about its demonic red eyes. Eleanor smiled tightly and said nothing. After that, she became more careful. She measured her words like precious spices, doling them out only when absolutely necessary, and even then cloaked in layers of submissive phrasing. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn, my lord, but have you considered... Perhaps it's not my place to say, but I'm sure you've already thought of this. Only, it was exhausting." The truly maddening part was that her advice was often right. When she suggested stocking extra firewood before winter, they avoided the worst of the shortages. When she quietly pointed out that the new tax collector seemed a little too fond of silver rings for a man on a modest salary, an investigation revealed had been skimming from the coffers. But the moment her observations edged too close to sounding like criticism, the shutters came down. The breaking point came during a dispute with a neighboring lord over grazing rights. Godfrey was prepared to escalate the matter, a show of force, a few veiled threats. But Eleanor, who had actually spoken to the shepherds in question, knew the conflict was based on a misunderstanding about an old boundary marker. She waited until they were alone, then broached the subject as delicately as she could. "My lord, the shepherds say the western pasture was never in dispute until the marker stone was moved. If we could simply—" Godfrey cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I've already made my decision. But the stone—" "Enough." His voice was ice. "I won't have you undermining me, not even in private." Eleanor clenched her hands in her lap. "I only meant to help." "Then learn your place." The next day, Godfrey led a group of armed men to the disputed pasture, where a tense standoff with the neighboring lord's retainers nearly turned violent. It was only when a particularly sharp-eyed shepherd noticed the original boundary stone, half buried in the undergrowth where someone had apparently kicked it, that the conflict was resolved. No one thanked Eleanor, though she was the one who'd told the shepherd where to look. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Godfrey snore, she made a decision. If her counsel was unwelcome, so be it. Let them blunder into their own mistakes. Let them lose grain to mold and feuds to pig hunts. She would keep her thoughts to herself, hoarding them like coins in a secret purse. And if, in the privacy of her own mind, she composed scathing commentary on every idiotic decision Godfrey made, well, that was her business. The next time Godfrey asked for her opinion, some half-hearted query about whether Lord So-and-so would prefer venison or boar at the upcoming feast, Eleanor smiled sweetly and said, "Whatever you think best, my lord." Godfrey looked vaguely disappointed, as though he'd expected her to argue. Eleanor turned back to her embroidery, humming softly. After all, a wise woman knew when to stay silent. And an even wiser one knew how to make her silence louder than words. Chapter 7. The Thrill of Being Bartered in War. 3 days after Eleanor overheard the first whispers of rebellion in the Northern Territories, Godfrey returned from court with that particular glint in his eye, the one that usually preceded either terrible decisions or expensive hunting dogs. This time, it was worse. "They're calling it the War of the Three Barons," he announced, tossing his gloves onto the table with the air of a man who had just been promised something unreasonable. Baron Dacre's raised an army, that bastard Fitzwalter's backing him, and de Lacy's just waiting to see which way the wind goes. Eleanor kept her needle moving steadily through the linen in her lap. "How unfortunate," she murmured. Godfrey missed the dryness in her tone entirely. "Unfortunate? It's perfect. The king needs loyal men now more than ever." He began pacing, the worn floorboards creaking under his boots. "If we pledge our forces, there'll be titles in it for us. Maybe even a piece of Dacre's lands when this is over." Eleanor thought of the last war Godfrey had participated in, a month-long skirmish that had consisted mostly of drunken knights setting fire to a barley field. And if the rebels win? Godfrey waved a hand. They won't, but even if they do, we'll have made ourselves valuable enough to come out ahead either way. That was when Eleanor understood. This wasn't about loyalty or even land. This was about Godfrey smelling opportunity in the chaos, like a crow spotting something shiny amidst battlefield corpses. The next few weeks passed in a blur of messengers and hastily called councils. Eleanor spent them managing the sudden influx of men-at-arms, who ate like locusts, and left the latrines in a state that defied description. Between supervising extra bread production and preventing the garrison from gambling away their armor, she barely noticed when the first real battle occurred, until the wounded began arriving. That was her first clue that this war might be different. Her second came when Godfrey returned from court with a feverish gleam in his eyes and a sealed letter bearing the royal seal. "It's done," he said, tossing the letter onto the table. "We're to host the peace negotiations next month." Eleanor eyed the parchment. "Peace? I thought you said the rebels were losing." "They are. That's why they're suing for peace." He grinned, the expression making him look eerily like his father. "And guess who's been chosen as a hostage against good behavior?" It took Eleanor a moment to understand. When she did, her embroidery needle slipped, drawing a tiny bead of blood. "You can't be serious." "Deadly serious. Fitzwalter's youngest daughter is to stay here as surety while the talks proceed. Royal command." He said it with relish, as though it were some great honor rather than the medieval equivalent of leaving a wallet on the table while you went to the tavern. Eleanor stared at him. "And if the talks fail, what then?" Godfrey shrugged. "Then we've got ourselves a noble hostage." The girl arrived on a rainy Tuesday, pale and shivering under a too-thin cloak. Lady Joanna Fitzwalter was 16 years old, with mousy brown hair and the wide, terrified eyes of a rabbit in a snare. Eleanor took one look at her and saw herself 20 years earlier. Another pawn shuffled across the board by men who wouldn't even remember her name in a year. Joanna's presence changed nothing and everything. The negotiations proceeded exactly as Eleanor had expected, slowly, with much posturing and frequent breaks for feasting. The men argued over borders and titles and reparations, while Joanna sat silently at meals, picking at her food like a prisoner counting down her last meal. It was during the third week of negotiations that everything unraveled. A messenger arrived caked in mud, his horse near collapse, bearing news that Baron Dacre had broken the truce, ambushed a royal supply train, and slaughtered the guards. The castle erupted into chaos. Godfrey and the other lords shouted themselves hoarse, debating retaliation. The Fitzwalter envoys turned ashen, knowing what this meant for their lady. And through it all Joanna sat frozen in the solar, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles stood out like pearls. Eleanor found her there hours later, when the shouting had died down and the men had retired to drink themselves into a stupor. The girl hadn't moved. "They won't." Joanna's voice cracked. "They wouldn't really." Eleanor knew what she was asking. Knew the answer, too. Hostages weren't just insurance. They were message senders. A hanged noblewoman made excellent punctuation in diplomatic correspondence. She sat beside Joanna, the stiff brocade of her gown rustling. "They might." Joanna made a small, choked noise. Eleanor studied the girl's profile. The trembling lip, the too fast breathing. She thought of her own daughters, still young enough to believe the world made sense. Thought of all the times she'd bit her tongue, bent her head, played the obedient wife. Then she made a decision. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the guard changes at midnight, the postern gate will be unguarded for 10 minutes. There's a rider waiting with 2 horses by the old oak near the stream. If you follow the stream south, you'll reach the road to Alnor. Joanna's head snapped up. "You're helping me escape?" Eleanor allowed herself a small, bitter smile. Let's just say I've developed a distaste for watching men use women as bargaining chips. The escape itself was almost comically simple. Joanna slipped away during the changing of the guard, just as Eleanor had promised. By the time the alarm was raised the next morning, she would be miles away, her trail lost in the network of sheep paths and old smugglers' routes Eleanor had painstakingly described. When Godfrey discovered the escape, his rage shook the rafters. "This is your doing," he bellowed, rounding on Eleanor. "You were the last one with her." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "She must have slipped away while I was at prayers." "You expect me to believe that?" She allowed her shoulders to rise and fall in a delicate shrug. "Believe what you like. But perhaps you should consider why the king sent her here in the first place." Godfrey froze. "What?" Eleanor kept her voice soft, reasonable. If Fitzwalter truly intended to betray the crown, would he have agreed to leave his daughter here? Or was this all a test, to see which lords would mistreat their hostages at the first sign of trouble? She watched the doubt creep into Godfrey's expression, watched him begin to question. It was masterful, really. Just enough truth to be plausible. The king was paranoid enough for such a scheme, just enough flattery to Godfrey's ego, implying he'd been entrusted with secret royal business. By the time the royal messenger arrived 3 days later, bearing news that the truce had been reaffirmed and all hostages were to be returned, Godfrey had convinced himself that Eleanor's version of events was not only possible, but likely. "Told you it was a test," he boasted to his companions, conveniently forgetting his earlier fury. Eleanor said nothing. She merely folded her hands and smiled the way she always did, like a woman who knew her place. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Godfrey snore, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. It wasn't freedom, not truly. But for once, she hadn't been a piece on the board. She'd moved one. Chapter 8. The Lord's Temper. A household hazard. Eleanor had learned to read Godfrey's moods the way sailors read the sky before a storm, with practiced wariness and an eye toward shelter. There was the tension in his jaw when a hunt went poorly, the way his fingers drummed when taxes came up short, the particular flush of his cheeks after too much wine. None of these boded well, but they were predictable, manageable. The truly dangerous tempers came without warning. Take the morning the stable master reported that Godfrey's favorite courser had gone lame. One moment, Godfrey was nodding along as the man explained the horse's treatment. The next, he had seized the nearest goblet and hurled it against the wall with enough force to send wine splattering across the tapestries. "The hell do I pay you for, if you can't even keep a horse sound?" The stable master, a grizzled man who had served 3 generations of Hargroves, stood frozen, his face carefully blank. Eleanor, passing through the hall on her way to inspect the linen stores, stopped mid-step. Godfrey's gaze snapped to her. What are she staring at? She knew better than to answer. Instead, she lowered her eyes and murmured something about checking on the children. It was the safest response. Godfrey might resent her, but he rarely took his temper out on the heirs. Not so the servants. The stable master was dismissed without pay for the month, and 2 grooms were whipped for good measure. By supper, the entire household moved like mice beneath a circling hawk, flinching at every raised voice, every sudden movement. This was the reality of living under a lord's roof. His anger was not just an emotion, it was a force of nature, as indiscriminate as hail and twice as destructive. A merchant could shout at his wife and perhaps earn a fine from the guild. A peasant might beat his daughter and face the priest's disapproval. But a lord answered to no one but God, and God, as it turned out, was remarkably lenient when it came to noblemen's tantrums. The worst of it was the unpredictability. Some days Godfrey could lose a small fortune at dice and laugh it off. Other times, a single overcooked pheasant could send him into a rage that left servants scrambling and Eleanor counting the exits. Once, after a particularly humiliating defeat in a tournament, Godfrey had taken his frustration out on the furniture, shattering chairs, overturning tables, even hacking at the bed curtains with his dagger. Eleanor had stood silently in the corner, calculating how much of the damage would come from her household allowance. The next morning, he had acted as though nothing had happened, complaining about his sore head while servants swept up the wreckage. No one mentioned the incident. That was the other rule. A lord's anger was to be weathered, not acknowledged. The children learned quickly. Young Aldrich, at 8, already knew to vanish when his father's voice took on that particular edge. Matilda, barely 5, had perfected the art of becoming invisible at will, a skill no child should need. Even the baby, little Hugh, seemed to sense the danger, falling eerily silent whenever Godfrey's boots thudded too heavily on the stairs. Eleanor herself had developed a dozen small strategies for survival. She kept her voice soft, her opinions scarcer, her body angled just so, not defiant, not cowering, neutral, unthreatening. She had learned to time her movements, to gauge when it was safe to speak, and when silence was the only shield. None of it was foolproof. The breaking point came on a day that had started unremarkably enough. Breakfast, the weekly accounting with Osbert, a brief visit to the still room to check on the new batch of feverfew. Then Godfrey returned early from hunting, empty-handed, and in a black mood. Eleanor knew the signs immediately. The too tight grip on his wine cup, the sharp way he dismissed the servants. She was halfway through suggesting he rest when he cut her off. "Don't tell me what to do." His voice was dangerously quiet. She pressed her lips together. A mistake. Godfrey's eyes narrowed. "What? No clever remark? No helpful advice?" Eleanor kept her hands still in her lap. "I only thought you might be tired." "Tired?" He snorted. "Of course, you think that. You've never worked a day in your life." The irony was almost laughable. Eleanor, who had spent the morning tallying supplies and mediating between the cook and the brewer, who had birthed 3 living children and buried 2 more, who managed an entire household on a budget that grew tighter every year. She had never worked. But she said none of this. Instead, she murmured, "As you say, my lord." It was the wrong response. Godfrey's face darkened. "Don't patronize me." "I didn't." The blow came without warning, a backhanded slap that snapped her head to the side and left her ears ringing. Eleanor tasted blood where her teeth had cut her lip. For a long moment there was only silence. Then Godfrey exhaled sharply, as though surprised at himself, and turned away. "See to that," he muttered, gesturing vaguely at her face before stalking out. Eleanor sat very still, listening to his footsteps fade. Around her the castle carried on as though nothing had happened. Servants bustling, dogs barking, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Life, uninterrupted. She touched her throbbing lip, her fingers coming away red. That evening, Godfrey was all contrition, bringing her a cup of wine with his own hands and making awkward jokes about his wretched temper. Eleanor smiled and accepted the cup, because what else could she do? Later, when he reached for her in bed, she didn't resist. She lay still and let him take what he wanted, her mind drifting far away, to the quiet of the still room, to the weight of her keys, to the thought of Joanna Fitzwalter riding south to freedom. The next morning she rose early and went about her duties as usual. No one remarked on the faint bruise at the corner of her mouth. No one ever did. That was the true horror of it, in the end. Not the violence itself, but the way the world conspired to pretend it hadn't happened. The way everyone, servants, family, even the priest, turned a blind eye because to acknowledge it would be to question the natural order. And the natural order was clear. A lord's home was his kingdom, his wife his subject, his temper his divine right. Eleanor tended her bruise with a salve of her own making, her fingers steady. Outside the sun rose, indifferent. Chapter 9. Fashion faux pas. Dressing for his status. The gown arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a red-faced messenger who looked as though he'd run the entire way from London. Eleanor knew what it was before the wrappings came off. Godfrey had been boasting for weeks about the surprise he'd commissioned from the famed tailor master Jacques. A peace offering, no doubt, for the bruise that had only just faded from her cheekbone. When the maids unfolded the garment, the solar filled with gasps. The fabric was a deep emerald silk so heavy it seemed to ripple like water, embroidered with golden thread in patterns so intricate they hurt to look at. Tiny seed pearls clustered at the cuffs and hem, and the sleeves, God help her, were lined with fur. "It's magnificent," murmured Agnes, the head seamstress, though Eleanor caught the woman's barely concealed wince at the impracticality of it all. Eleanor reached out to touch the fabric, then stopped. It wasn't hers to judge, really. The gown wasn't for her. It was for Godfrey, for his reputation, for the way other lords would nudge each other and whisper, "Daddy, you see Hargrove's wife?" That silk must have cost a fortune. "You'll wear it to the Michaelmas feast," Godfrey announced later, puffing up like a cock in a henhouse as he admired his own generosity spread across the bed. "The bishop will be there, and half the peerage besides. Let them see what House Hargrove can afford." Eleanor smiled, the way she always did when receiving orders, and said nothing about how the high, stiff collar would chafe her neck raw, or how the fitted bodice would make it impossible to draw a full breath, or how the weight of the skirts would leave her hips aching by night's end. The morning of the feast dawned hot, an unseasonable burst of late summer heat that turned the castle into a stone oven. Eleanor stood motionless as Agnes and two other maids laced her into the gown, layer by miserable layer. First the linen shift, damp with sweat before they'd even begun. Then the stiffened kirtle, laced so tight her ribs protested. Then the silk monstrosity itself, which required 3 people to maneuver over her head without tearing. "Breathe out, my lady," Agnes instructed, yanking the back laces with the vigor of a sailor securing rigging. Eleanor obeyed, her vision spotting as her lungs compressed. This was always the worst part, that moment when her body ceased to be hers and became instead a mannequin upon which Godfrey's status would be displayed. The final touch was the wimple, an elaborate construction of white linen and golden wire that framed her face like a prisoner's stocks. Agnes pinned it into place with enough force to make Eleanor's scalp tingle. "There," the seamstress said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Fit for a queen." Eleanor caught her reflection in the polished metal mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back was stiff, gleaming, immaculate, and utterly inhuman. Downstairs, the feast was already in full swing. The great hall stank of roasted meat and unwashed nobility, the heat from the hearths making the air swim. Eleanor took her place beside Godfrey, moving carefully so as not to dislodge a single pearl or golden thread. "Took you long enough," he muttered, though his eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he took in the envious glances from nearby lords. The first hour passed in a haze of discomfort. The collar sawed at her neck with every turn of her head. The tight sleeves made it impossible to lift her wine cup without dribbling. Sweat trickled down her back beneath all those layers, the salt stinging where the kirtle had rubbed her skin raw. Then came the dancing. "Lady Hargrove will lead the pavane," Godfrey announced to the room at large, as though offering up a prized mare for inspection. Eleanor had no choice but to rise and take her place at the center of the floor, every eye upon her. The music began, and with it the slow, measured steps of the dance, a torture disguised as pageantry. The heavy skirts tangled around her legs, the tight bodice made each breath a struggle, and the wimple's pins jabbed her scalp with every turn. Halfway through she caught a glimpse of Lady Devereux, a sharp-faced woman who had once confided that she kept a stash of soft, worn shifts hidden beneath her floorboards, for when the feasting grew unbearable. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Eleanor saw the same desperate calculation she felt herself. How much longer must I endure this before I can plausibly retire? Nice. How? The answer, as it turned out, was 3 more dances, 2 interminable courses of food, and 1 excruciating poetry recital in honor of the bishop. By the time Godfrey finally allowed her to withdraw, the sun had long since set, and Eleanor's body ached as though she'd been in battle. Back in her chambers, Agnes and the maids descended like vultures to unpick the elaborate construction. The wimple came off first, revealing reddened skin where the pins had dug in. Then the gown itself, peeled away like a second skin to expose the angry lines left by the kirtle's boning. Beneath it all, her shift was soaked through, the linen clinging to her like a shroud. As the maids carefully folded the emerald silk away, it would be stored with lavender to keep off moths until the next grand occasion. Eleanor sat by the window in her plainest nightdress, gulping the blessedly cool air. A soft knock came at the door. Godfrey entered without waiting for a response, already half undressed and smelling of wine. "You were magnificent tonight," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Half the lords here are green with envy." Eleanor murmured something appropriately grateful, her eyes on the moon outside. Godfrey yawned, stretching. "Master Jacques says he can do a similar style in crimson for Christmastide, with ermine this time." She felt the noose of that future gown tighten around her throat already. When Godfrey had gone to his own chambers, Eleanor remained by the window, scratching idly at the kirtle marks on her ribs. Somewhere out there, she imagined, a peasant woman was sleeping in a simple shift, her skin unbound, her hair loose. Somewhere, a merchant's wife was choosing her own fabrics based on comfort rather than display. And somewhere, she hoped, Joanna Fitzwalter was wearing whatever the hell she pleased. Eleanor blew out the candle and lay down, her body still throbbing in protest. Tomorrow the silk would be packed away, the pins would be collected, and she would return to her simpler, if no less restrictive, day-to-day garb. But for now, in the dark, she could almost pretend she was free. Chapter 10. Church-approved misery. The chapel at Hargrove Keep was a small, drafty affair, its stone walls sweating in winter and baking in summer, its lone, stained-glass window depicting St. Agnes looking suspiciously like Godfrey's great-grandmother. Eleanor attended Mass there every morning without fail, kneeling on the hard wooden bench until her knees ached, her lips moving automatically through prayers she'd memorized in childhood. Today's sermon was a particularly inspired piece of torture. Father Oswin, a man whose jowls quivered with righteous fervor, had chosen as his text Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. In me. The natural order, he intoned, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, is for the wife to obey as the church obeys Christ, to suffer as the martyrs suffered, to bear her burdens with patience and humility. Eleanor kept her eyes downcast, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Out of the corner of her eye she could see Godfrey nodding along, his expression smug. Father Oswin warmed to his theme. Consider the blessed Saint Monica, who wept and prayed for 30 years for the conversion of her wayward son. Think of the virtuous Susanna, falsely accused yet silent in her suffering. Eleanor wondered, not for the first time, if the saints would have been quite so celebrated if they'd been men. She imagined Saint Monica throwing a sandal at Augustine's head instead of weeping piously. The thought almost made her smile. Beside her, Lady Marian sighed gustily, no doubt remembering her own wayward husband and his village mistress. Across the aisle, young Lady Devereux, newly wed and still bright-eyed, looked vaguely ill. The sermon dragged on, each word a hammer blow. Wives were to be meek. Wives were to endure. Wives were to consider their suffering a form of divine refinement, like gold in the furnace. By the time the final blessing was given, Eleanor's knees had gone numb, and her stomach growled in protest. She'd fasted since midnight, as was proper before taking the Eucharist. Godfrey rose with a satisfied stretch, as though personally credited for the Church's teachings on wifely obedience. In his sermon, he announced to no one in particular. Eleanor murmured agreement, because to do otherwise would be to risk both Godfrey's temper and Father Oswin's disappointed lectures. She had learned early that the Church's mercy, like her husband's, was conditional. The rest of the day passed in the usual blur of household duties, but the sermon lingered like a bad taste. At dinner, when Godfrey criticized the venison seasoning, Eleanor bit back her retort and thought of Susanna. When he forgot that she'd asked for the dairymaid's daughter to be spared a beating after breaking a jug, she swallowed her anger and thought of Monica. It was only that night, as she prepared for bed, that she allowed herself a moment of rebellion. The Book of Hours she'd been given at her wedding, a beautifully illuminated volume with gold-leaf saints and painstaking Latin, lay on her bedside table. Eleanor flipped past the psalms and prayers to the blank vellum at the back. With a tiny charcoal pencil kept hidden in her sewing basket, she began to sketch. Not saints or angels, but a series of small vicious caricatures. Father Oswin with pig's ears, Godfrey as a strutting cockerel, herself as a mouse pinned under a giant thumb. It was foolish, dangerous even. If anyone found them, Eleanor blew the charcoal dust away and closed the book, hiding her treason beneath the Word of God. The next morning's Mass was no better. Today's text was from Peter. Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. And Father Oswin had clearly decided to outdo himself. A woman's silence, he thundered, is her glory, her suffering, her crown. Eleanor stared at a cobweb in the corner of the ceiling and counted the seconds until she could leave. Afterward, as the household dispersed, Father Oswin cornered her in the cloister. Lady Hargrove, he said, his voice oozing concern, I couldn't help but notice you seemed distracted during my sermon. Eleanor folded her hands demurely. I was meditating on your words, Father. He studied her face, his eyes narrowed. You mustn't chafe against God's design. Your husband's authority is his will. Of course, Father. The priest hesitated, clearly hoping for more. Confessions of discontent, perhaps, or pleas for guidance that would give him further opportunities to lecture. When none came, he sighed. I pray for you. Eleanor bent her head in apparent humility. Thank you, Father. As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her back, judging. That was the true genius of the Church's teachings, she reflected. They didn't just command obedience. They made you complicit in your own subjugation. Every Mass, every confession, every whispered prayer reinforced the same message. Your misery is holy. Back in her chambers, Eleanor took out her Book of Hours again. This time she sketched Father Oswin as a spider, weaving a web of scripture to trap the unwary. Then she carefully erased it. Some rebellions she had learned were best kept silent. Chapter 11. The honor of dying in childbirth. Eleanor had known her 6th pregnancy would be her last. Not by choice. Women like her didn't get choices, but because her body had begun to rebel. The familiar nausea had been sharper this time, the exhaustion more bone-deep, the ache in her hips a constant companion even before her belly swelled. The midwife, Agnes, had pursed her lips during the examination, her worn hands lingering too long on Eleanor's too thin wrists. God willing, the old woman had muttered, which Eleanor knew was midwife speak for Hayur, not long for this world, eh? She hadn't told Godfrey. There was no point. He would either dismiss her concerns as female hysterics or, worse, begin discreet inquiries about potential second wives, noble daughters of good breeding stock who might give him sons without the inconvenience of Eleanor's failing health. The household carried on as usual, oblivious. The children played in the solar, Unaware, their mother moved through her days like a ghost already half departed. The servants still brought her household accounts to review, still asked whether the summer linen should be stored with lavender or rosemary. Life, relentless, refused to pause for her quiet unraveling. The pains began 2 months too soon, on a night thick with the scent of impending rain. Eleanor knew immediately something was wrong. The cramps were too sharp, the bleeding too heavy. She sent for Agnes with hands that shook only slightly, then lay back on the bed, counting the cracks in the ceiling beams. Agnes arrived with her usual bag of horrors: herbs, knives, a silver crucifix she liked to press into laboring women's hands for courage. One look at Eleanor's pallor and the old woman's face went grim. "This babe's coming early," she announced, as though Eleanor hadn't already deduced as much. And sideways, by the feel of it. Eleanor closed her eyes. A sideways birth. Just her luck. The next hours passed in a haze of pain and half-heard whispers. Agnes barked orders at the maids. "Boil water, fetch clean linen, pray louder, damn you," while Eleanor bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. Somewhere beyond the chamber doors, she knew the household was assembling for the vigil. The good Christian women would murmur about sacrifice and God's will. The men would drink in the hall and pretend not to count the minutes until news arrived. "Push, my lady," Agnes commanded, her hands pressing hard on Eleanor's belly. "Unless you mean to take this laziness to your grave." Eleanor pushed. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot vice crushing her from within. She thought, absurdly, of the embroidered cushions in the solar, the ones she'd never finished. Dimly she became aware of a new voice in the room, Father Oswin's droning Latin as he performed the last rites. That was bad, wasn't it? Last rites meant dying. Dying meant... Agnes slapped her cheek. "None of that, my lady. Stay with us." The next contraction ripped through her, and Eleanor screamed into the leather, her vision swimming. Somewhere in the red haze she heard Agnes swear, and felt the woman's hands inside her, twisting, pulling. Then, miraculously, the pressure eased. A thin, reedy wail filled the chamber. "A girl," Agnes announced, holding up the bloody, squalling thing. Small, but alive. Eleanor barely had strength to lift her head. "The baby!" Her daughter was tiny, her skin nearly translucent, her cries more kitten than human. "Take her," Eleanor whispered. Agnes hesitated. "You should rest first." "Take here." The midwife obeyed, bundling the infant in clean linen before placing her in Eleanor's arms. The weight was negligible, the warmth profound. Eleanor traced one finger over the baby's wrinkled forehead, her own breath coming in shallow gasps. "What will you name her?" one of the maids whispered. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Joan Dortgel. After no saint, no ancestor, just a name she'd always fancied, one that belonged solely to this tiny, improbable creature. Agnes was still working between Eleanor's legs, her expression growing darker by the minute. The bleeding hadn't stopped. If anything, it had worsened, a slow, steady seep that no poultice or prayer seemed able to staunch. "Fetch the Lord," Agnes told a maid, her voice low. Eleanor knew what that meant. Knew, too, how this scene would play out. Godfrey would arrive, somber and dignified, to receive his daughter and bid his wife a respectful farewell. There would be talk of her courage, of God's mysterious ways. Within a year he'd remarry, some plump young thing with wide hips meant for childbearing. And Joan? Joan would be raised by wet nurses and governesses, her mother reduced to a portrait on the wall, a name in the family Bible, a cautionary tale about the perils of womanhood. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, Eleanor felt only a strange calm. She touched Joan's cheek again, memorizing the feel of downy skin, the rhythm of shallow breaths. When Godfrey entered, his face was carefully arranged in an expression of concern. "Eleanor." "Her name is Joan," Eleanor interrupted, her voice stronger than it had any right to be. "Joan Hargrove. You will remember that." Godfrey blinked, taken aback by her tone. Of course, but... No. Eleanor tightened her grip on the baby, her vision tunneling, but her voice unwavering. You will say it. Her name is Joan. A beat of silence. Then, grudgingly, Joan. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. It was a small victory, but hers. Outside, the rain began in earnest, pattering against the window like impatient fingers. Agnes pressed a cup of something bitter to Eleanor's lips. Drink, the midwife ordered, for the pain. Eleanor drank. The world softened at the edges, the pain receding like a tide. Joan's weight in her arms grew heavier, warmer. Somewhere, far away, someone was praying. Eleanor closed her eyes. And just like that, the Honorable Lady Hargrove was no more. Chapter 12. Widowhood, freedom or another cage. Eleanor opened her eyes to candlelight. This was unexpected. The room smelled of burnt herbs and stale sweat, the bed linen stiff with dried blood beneath her. Someone had closed her eyes, washed her face, and crossed her hands over her chest, all of the preparations for a corpse. Yet here she was, painfully alive, her body a map of aches and her mouth tasting of death. A gasp came from her left. My lady? Eleanor turned her head, an act that sent fire lancing through her neck, to see young Alice, the maid-servant, gaping at her with the expression of one witnessing a particularly inconvenient miracle. Order, Eleanor croaked. Alice scrambled to obey, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste. The cup she pressed to Eleanor's lips was blessedly cool, the water slightly stale but more delicious than the finest wine. The babe? Eleanor managed when she could speak again. In the nursery, my lady, small but thriving. Alice hesitated. The Lord has already sent for the priest to christen her Joan, as you asked. Eleanor closed her eyes. So Godfrey had honored her dying wish. How surprisingly decent of him. She wondered if he'd already commissioned her tomb. The next few days passed in a haze of weak broth and fitful sleep. Agnes came daily to poke and prod, muttering about stubborn women and miraculous recoveries with equal disdain. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The fever that should have carried her off receded like a cowardly army. By week's end, Eleanor could sit up without vomiting. It was during one such upright moment that Godfrey finally deigned to visit. He stood at the foot of her bed, looking vaguely put out, as though her survival were a personal inconvenience. You gave us a scare, he said, which Eleanor supposed passed for concern in his world. She smoothed the blanket over her lap. My apologies. The physician says you'll live. He said it like an accusation. So it would seem. Godfrey cleared his throat. There's the matter of your dower rights to discuss. Of course. Even near death couldn't spare her from property law. Tradition dictated that a widow received 1/3 of her husband's estate for her lifetime use, a comfortable living, assuming the husband didn't find creative ways to circumvent the custom. Given Godfrey's expression, he'd already consulted several lawyers on the subject. I've set aside the manor at Widowhood, he continued. It's small but suitable. You'll have an allowance for household expenses, of course. Eleanor digested this. Willowford was a damp, crumbling pile, 2 days' ride from Hargrove, notorious for its leaking roof and resident mold colonies. The allowance would no doubt be just enough to keep her from starvation, while ensuring she couldn't afford to remarry or travel. And Joan? Godfrey's face hardened. The child remains at Hargrove, naturally. Naturally. Because what use did a widow have for her own daughter? I see, Eleanor said softly. Godfrey misinterpreted her tone as acquiescence. You'll depart as soon as you're well enough to travel. A month, perhaps. A month to recover from nearly dying. How generous. When he'd gone, Eleanor lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. She should have been grateful, she supposed. She'd survived childbirth, a feat many women didn't manage, and would live out her days in modest comfort. It was more than most peasant women could hope for. And yet, thought of being packed off to Widowhood like an unwanted piece of furniture rankled. The idea of leaving Joan to be raised by strangers, by Godfrey's inevitable new wife, made her hands clench in the blankets. A scratching at the door interrupted her thoughts. Alice entered, bearing a tray of bread and weak ale. The girl set it down carefully, then hesitated. "My lady, the servants are taking wagers on how long before the Lord remarries." Eleanor snorted. "What's the favorite?" "Before Michaelmas." 3 months. "How flattering." Alice fidgeted with her apron. "They say he's already sent inquiries to Lord Devereux about his youngest daughter." Of course he had. 18, healthy hips, and, most importantly, a fat dowry. Godfrey would have his heir and his lands, Joan would have a stepmother, and Eleanor would have her damp little manor and her memories. Alice hesitated again, then blurted, "You could become a nun, my lady." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "The abbey at Greensward takes noble widows," Alice continued. "They say the abbess lets women read books. Real ones, not just prayer books." The idea was tempting. An abbey would mean independence of a sort. No more marriages, no more pregnancies, no more Godfrey. But it would also mean never seeing Joan again, never watching her grow. "Thank you, Alice," Eleanor said at last. "But I think I've had enough of institutions telling me what to do." The girl nodded and withdrew, leaving Eleanor to her thoughts and the slowly congealing ale. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, pattering against the window like impatient fingers. Eleanor watched the droplets trace paths down the glass, her mind turning. Widowhood was a cage, yes, but even cages had doors. And Eleanor had spent a lifetime learning how to slip through them. Chapter 13. The Delusion of Chivalry. The minstrel arrived on Midsummer's Eve, a gangly youth, with a lute strapped to his back and a head full of songs about valiant knights and fair maidens. Eleanor watched from her seat in the great hall as he tuned his instrument with the self-importance of a bishop preparing to deliver a sermon. "Tonight," he announced with a flourish, "I shall sing the lay of Sir Lancelot and the fair Elaine." Godfrey thumped his goblet on the table in approval, spilling wine across the already stained wood. Around him, the household knights leaned forward, their faces alight with anticipation. Even the servants slowed their steps, hoping to catch snippets of the tale. Eleanor took a measured sip of her watered wine and prepared to endure. The minstrel's voice was surprisingly pleasant, weaving a tale of Lancelot's daring rescue of Elaine from a tower guarded by fire-breathing dragons. The maiden was beautiful, of course, raven-haired and ivory-skinned, with eyes like sapphires and lips like rosebuds. The knight was brave and true, cleaving through monsters as though they were made of parchment. At the climax, when Lancelot burst into the tower to find Elaine swooning gracefully against the window seat, Eleanor nearly snorted into her cup. In her experience, any woman locked in a tower for months would be less swooning maiden and more furious harridan with unwashed hair and a desperate need for a chamber pot. But the minstrel sang on, oblivious. The lovers pledged their troth, the dragons were vanquished, and the kingdom rejoiced. The final note hung in the air, met with rapturous applause from the men and polite clapping from the women. "Magnificent," Godfrey boomed. "A tale of true chivalry." Eleanor studied the dregs of her wine. True chivalry, as far as she could tell, involved a great deal of swordplay and very little consideration of what Elaine might have wanted. Did she wish to be carried off by Lancelot? Had anyone asked? And what of the practicalities? Where would they live? Who would manage their household? Did Lancelot even have an income, or was he counting on loot from dragon slaying to pay the bills? The minstrel, encouraged by his success, launched into another ballad, This one about a knight who fought 100 men to win his lady's favor. Her smile was his banner, the youth sang, her love his shining armor. Eleanor thought of the countless noblewomen she knew, their lives spent managing unruly servants, balancing household accounts, and producing heirs until their bodies gave out. Not one of them had ever described marriage as shining armor. More like slightly rusty and uncomfortably tight. Lady Marian, seated nearby, caught Eleanor's eye and smirked. "My husband once tried to joust for my favor," she murmured. "Missed his tilt and speared a chicken instead. We had it for supper." Eleanor stifled a laugh. That, at least, was a love story she could believe. The minstrel was reaching his crescendo now, the knight having slain all 100 foes to claim his prize. The lady, overcome with gratitude, bestowed upon him a silken favor, which, Eleanor noted, was the medieval equivalent of getting a medal for extreme violence. The song ended to thunderous applause. Godfrey, flushed with wine and vicarious glory, tossed the minstrel a silver coin. "Another. Sing of Tristan and Isolde." The minstrel obliged, his fingers dancing across the lute strings. This tale was even more absurd. A story of forbidden love, poison, and misunderstandings that could have been solved with a single coherent conversation. Eleanor let her mind wander as the familiar tropes unfolded. The tragic glances, the stolen kisses, the inevitable doom. None of it bore any resemblance to the marriages she knew. Where were the ballads about wives negotiating with tax collectors? The epics of women surviving childbirth? The romances that featured a knight remembering his lady's name after 20 years of marriage? A tug on her sleeve brought her back to the present. Young Joan, her dark eyes wide, had crept from the nursery to listen. "Mama, is that true?" she whispered, pointing at the minstrel. Eleanor considered the question. She could lie, perpetuate the fantasy that love conquered all and men were gallant. Or she could tell the truth, that marriage was a political arrangement, that men were as likely to forget their wives' birthdays as slay dragons, and that no amount of poetry changed the fact that women's lives were hard work with little glory. She settled for a middle ground. "It's a story, sweeting, like the ones about talking animals." Joan nodded sagely. "Like the fox who outwits the hounds?" "Exactly like that," Eleanor said, smiling. The minstrel finished with a dramatic flourish and the hall erupted in cheers. Godfrey, inspired by the tales of valor, declared an impromptu tournament to be held the next day. The knights roared their approval, already boasting of the feats they would perform. Eleanor gathered Joan into her lap, smoothing the child's hair. Tomorrow, while the men played at war, she would be overseeing the preparations, the seating arrangements, the food, the bandages for the inevitable injuries. There would be no ballads about that. But perhaps, she thought as she carried Joan toward bed, that was for the best. Some truths were better left unsung. Chapter 14. The fine print in your wedding vows. The morning of Eleanor's wedding had been a blur of scented oils and tightly laced sleeves, of last-minute instructions from her mother about wifely duties and whispered warnings from her nurse about the marriage bed. No one had thought to explain the vows themselves. Those solemn Latin phrases she dutifully repeated before God and half the nobility of the Shire. At 12 years old she'd imagined them as magical words, like in the fairy tales the kitchen maids told, spells that would transform her into a grand lady overnight. It wasn't until years later that Eleanor truly understood what she'd promised. One seemed simple enough at first glance. Obey her husband's commands, his whims, his moods. But the reality was far more expansive. It meant obeying even when his orders were foolish, even when they harmed her, even when they made her complicit in cruelty. It meant holding her tongue when he squandered their coin on hunting dogs, nodding when he beat a servant for an imagined slight smiling when he took her to bed despite her exhaustion. Gan, peito serve, ante, needed sanatan ante dones. A pretty word for endless labor. Serving meant rising before dawn to oversee the household, meant stitching his shirts until her fingers bled, meant breeding heirs until her body rebelled. It meant serving his guests before she ate, serving his pride before her dignity, serving his comfort before her own survival. Ani, most insidious of the three. Honor demanded she pretend respect where none was due, that she defend his name even when he sullied it, that she kneel in church and thank God for the privilege of being his property. The worst part was how everyone pretended these vows were gifts rather than chains. The priests spoke of them as sacred duties, the minstrels as romantic ideals, the other wives as natural law. Even now, at 32, Eleanor could recall the way her mother had patted her hand after the ceremony and said, "You'll grow into them," as though obedience were a pair of shoes to be broken in rather than a cage to be endured. She'd learned the full weight of those vows quickly enough. Like the time Godfrey had insisted on hosting a midsummer feast despite an outbreak of fever in the village. When Eleanor had dared to suggest postponing, he'd reminded her, with a grip on her wrist that left bruises, of her promise to obey. 3 guests had fallen ill. 1 had died. No one had blamed Godfrey. Or the endless pregnancies, each one chipping away at her health because his right to an heir outweighed her right to survive. That too was in the vows, the unspoken promise to let her body be used up in his service. Even in small things, the vows dictated her life. The way she had to feign delight at his terrible hunting stories. The way she had to praise his taste in wine, even when he bought vinegar at gold prices. The way she had to pretend his infidelities didn't humiliate her, because a good wife honored her husband by ignoring his flaws. The bitterest irony was that Godfrey himself barely remembered his own vows. Cato love and cherishing had fallen by the wayside before their first anniversary. Cato protector had lasted only until his temper flared. And Ito be faithful, well, that had never been part of the bargain, not really. Eleanor sometimes wondered what would happen if wives were allowed to write their own vows. She promised to pretend your jokes are amusing. And you can sing, and that steady. She vowed to clean up the messes you leave, literal and otherwise. Neither. She swear to remember your mother's birthday, since you certainly won't. When I think that you be see is silicon. But such thoughts were dangerous. A wife's duty was to accept, not to question, to endure, not to rebel. Yet as Eleanor watched Joan playing with her dolls in the solar, already mimicking the courtesies and curtsies of a proper lady, she felt a spark of defiance. When the time came for her daughter's wedding, Eleanor would make sure the girl understood the vows. Not the pretty lies, but the brutal truths hidden beneath the Latin phrases. And if Joan chose to say them anyway, well, at least she'd do so with her eyes open. Chapter 15. The loneliness of the noblewoman's parlor. Eleanor's afternoons were punctuated by carefully orchestrated visits from ladies who were never quite friends. The solar at Hargrove Keep, with its embroidered cushions and weak winter sunlight filtering through leaded glass, became a stage where alliances were performed under the guise of companionship. Lady Beatrice arrived every Thursday without fail, her laughter a touch too bright, her compliments a shade too polished. She was the wife of Lord Montague, whose lands bordered Godfrey's, a fact that explained her relentless visits far more convincingly than any professed affection for Eleanor's company. Their conversations followed the same winding path each week, the health of their children never too detailed lest it reveal weakness, the quality of the autumn harvest, carefully neutral, and the latest fashions from London, a safe topic provided they avoided mentioning how far behind Hargrove's tailors lagged. "You must come visit my new falcon," Beatrice said during one such visit, stirring honey into her wine with a silver spoon. "A gift from my lord husband. She's a beauty. Perfect plumage." Eleanor smiled and nodded. She had no interest in falconry, and Beatrice knew it. The invitation was not for Eleanor's benefit, but to give Godfrey and Montague an excuse to meet and discuss their ongoing dispute over a strip of woodland. The entire visit was a pantomime, performed for the benefit of their husbands' political needs. The only respite from these choreographed social calls came in the form of Lady Marian, Godfrey's sharp-tongued sister, whose marriage to a minor lord had granted her just enough independence to occasionally speak her mind. Marian arrived unannounced one dreary February afternoon, scattering rainwater across the solar floor and waving away the servants with an impatient hand. "God's teeth, Eleanor, how do you endure these hens?" she demanded, flopping into a chair with none of the usual noblewoman's grace. "Beatrice simpering alone would drive me to drink." Eleanor let out an undignified snort and signaled for a servant to bring spiced wine. Marian was the only woman in the county who didn't bother pretending their interactions served some greater political purpose. "She means well," Eleanor said mildly, though they both knew it was a lie. Marian rolled her eyes. "She means to keep her husband's lands intact. Don't mistake strategy for kindness." They lapsed into comfortable silence, the kind only possible when neither woman needed to measure her words. Marian sipped her wine and watched the rain trace crooked paths down the window panes. "Do you remember Isabelle de Clermont?" Eleanor stiffened. Isabelle had been the closest thing she'd had to a true friend in those early years at Hargrove, a sharp-witted, bookish woman married to a neighboring lord. They had exchanged letters, lent each other volumes from their meager collections, even managed a few private conversations that strayed beyond the usual pleasantries. Then, abruptly, the visits had stopped. The letters went unanswered. "She was sent to a nunnery," Marian said, answering the unspoken question. "Not for piety, mind you. Her husband decided her opinions were too inconvenient." She paused, then added, "He remarried within the year. Some simpering girl of 16. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her cup. She had suspected as much, of course, but hearing it confirmed still sent a cold ripple through her. Isabelle had been clever, outspoken, qualities that might have been celebrated in a man, but were dangerous in a wife. And so she had been disposed of, neatly and quietly, with the full sanction of the church. Marian gave her a knowing look. "Be careful who you trust, Eleanor. Even me." The warning was unnecessary. Eleanor had learned long ago that friendships between noblewomen were as fragile as spun sugar. A falling out between their husbands, a shift in political favor, a disputed inheritance. Any of these could turn a confidante into a stranger overnight. The true loneliness of the noblewoman's parlor wasn't the lack of company. It was the knowledge that every conversation, every shared confidence, every moment of camaraderie existed only at the sufferance of the men who controlled their lives. When Marian left, the rain had turned to sleet. Eleanor stood at the window, watching her friend's carriage disappear down the muddy road. Then she turned back to the solar, to the empty chairs, the half-finished embroidery, the silence. Somewhere, Isabelle de Clermont was kneeling on cold stone, her books taken, her voice silenced. Eleanor picked up her needle and resumed her stitching. The parlor was very quiet. Chapter 16. The Myth of the Gentle Lord. The minstrels never sang of ordinary decency. Eleanor realized this one evening as she listened to yet another ballad about Lord Aldrich the Benevolent, a man whose legend had grown so outsized that even the weather seemed to improve when he entered a room, if the songs were to be believed. According to the latest rendition, Aldrich had once spared an entire village from taxation because a peasant girl's tears moved his heart. Eleanor happened to know that the real Aldrich had only waived those taxes after calculating it would cost him more to send collectors than had recouped from the impoverished hamlet. But facts mattered little in the crafting of legends. Godfrey, predictably, was enraptured. Now, Pythias, a lord who understood noblesse oblige, he declared, thumping his goblet on the table for emphasis. Eleanor sipped her wine and said nothing. Noblesse oblige, in her experience, was what lords called it when they did the bare minimum, not to be remembered as complete monsters. The truth was that basic decency in a nobleman was so rare it became mythologized. A lord who didn't beat his servants senseless for minor mistakes was merciful. One who refrained from seducing every maidservant in his household was chaste. And a husband who didn't strike his wife in front of guests? That was practically sainthood. She'd seen it happen with Godfrey himself. That time he'd sent a basket of bread to a sick tenant family? The gesture had been talked about for months, as though he'd performed some miracle of generosity rather than the most rudimentary act of Christian charity. Never mind that the bread was stale, or that the same tenant had been evicted the following winter when he couldn't pay his rent. The story endured, polished brighter with each retelling. Even among the other noblewomen, the bar for male virtue was laughably low. Lady Montague once wept with gratitude when her husband remembered her name day, a feat the man managed approximately once every 3 years. Marianne's sister-in-law considered herself fortunate because her lord only gambled away part of her dowry. The most absurd example came during the Michaelmas feast, when Lord Devereux made a great show of allowing his wife to choose between 2 gowns for the evening. The gasps of admiration from the other ladies might as well have been for a man who'd tamed a dragon. "Such consideration," whispered Lady Fitzwalter, clutching her pearls as though witnessing the second coming. Eleanor, who had watched Devereux backhand that same wife for spilling wine not a month prior, nearly choked on her wafers. What struck her most was how eagerly women participated in this myth-making. They praised their husbands' scant virtues to the skies, turning molehills of common decency into mountains of magnanimity. Perhaps because admitting the truth, that most lords were selfish, petty tyrants, was too bleak to contemplate. Or perhaps because perpetuating the lie made their own subjugation feel more palatable. The irony was that the same minstrels who spun tales of Aldrich the Benevolent never sang of the truly remarkable women Eleanor knew. There was no ballad for Marian, who managed her husband's estates with more skill than he'd ever possessed. No epic for old Lady Hargrove, who'd survived 5 childbirths and outlived 3 husbands. No romantic lays about the countless noblewomen who kept their families fed and their households running while their husbands played at war and politics. No, those stories weren't entertaining enough. Better to sing of lords who performed occasional kindnesses than of women who endured daily hardships with quiet competence. The evening wore on, the minstrel moving from Aldrich's exploits to more general paeans about chivalry. Godfrey grew increasingly maudlin with each verse, no doubt imagining himself the hero of some future ballad. Eleanor studied her husband in the flickering torchlight, the wine-stained tunic, the thinning hair, the petulant set of his mouth. This was no legendary lord, just a man who occasionally remembered to act human. And that, she supposed, was remarkable enough in its own way. Chapter 17. Your legacy. His name on your tombstone. The stonecutter arrived on a grey morning in November, his tools clinking in their leather satchel like a miser's coins. Eleanor watched from the solar window as he trudged across the courtyard, mud clinging to his boots, his breath fogging in the cold air. He had been summoned to discuss her tomb. Godfrey, of course, had already decided everything. The tomb would be of imported marble, naturally, nothing but the finest for the Hargrove lineage. It would feature an effigy of Eleanor in her finest gown, hands folded piously over her chest, face frozen in serene repose. And across the base, in letters deep enough to outlast the centuries, it would read, "Here lies Eleanor, beloved wife of Lord Godfrey Hargrove. Not Eleanor of Blackmore, though that had been her name first. Not mother of Aldrich, Joan, and Hugh, though that had been her greatest labor. Certainly not keeper of counts, healer of quarrels, survivor of 6 childbirths, though those had been her battles. No, in death as in life, she would belong to Godfrey. The stonecutter cleared his throat when he entered the solar, clutching his cap in ink-stained fingers. "My lord says you're to approve the design, my lady." He unfurled a scrap of parchment on the table between them, revealing a crude sketch. The effigy's face was blank, generic. It could have been any noblewoman. Only the Hargrove crest at the base confirmed it was meant to be her. Eleanor studied the drawing, her fingers hovering over the lines. "Is there room to add anything?" The stonecutter shifted uncomfortably. "My lord specified the wording, my lady." "Of course he did." She almost laughed. Even now, as she edged toward the grave, Godfrey controlled the narrative. The stonecutter hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's space on the sides for small carvings. Many ladies choose their patron saint or a favorite flower." Eleanor met his eyes and saw the unspoken offer there. A secret rebellion chiseled in stone. She rose and went to her writing desk, returning with a small piece of parchment. On it she'd drawn 3 things: a quill, a key, and a turnip. The stonecutter blinked at the last one. "My family grew turnips at Blackmore," Eleanor said simply. "The soil's perfect for them." She didn't explain the quill, for the letter she'd written to Isabel burned now. She didn't explain the key, for the household she'd run, the people she'd protected. Some truths didn't need words. The stonecutter folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into his tunic. "It's not fitting," he murmured, "for a woman's whole life to be summed up as wife of." Eleanor smiled. "No, it isn't." When he was gone, she returned to the window. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, dusting the courtyard in fleeting white. Soon, she knew, there would be a tomb with Godfrey's name writ large, and her own deeds hidden in the margin. But perhaps that was the way of the world. Men took up space in life and demanded it in death, while women carved out what corners they could. The snow fell. The tomb would be cut. And someday, if a curious child traced their fingers over the worn carvings on its side, they might wonder about the woman who'd chosen a quill, a key, and a turnip for her legacy. That was enough.